All right, welcome to Conscious Politics Part 2. Let's jump right in. We have an enormous amount of material to cover, and I am super excited about this. I can't tell you how excited I am. I've been planning this all week. In fact, there's so much material to cover that we're going to need an extra episode. We're still going to be busy laying the foundation here in Part 2. The practical stuff will come towards the end, I promise. It's going to be worthwhile to really lay a deep foundation here, which is what is necessary. Otherwise, I'm just going to give you a list of principles and policies, and you're not going to understand why the policies are what they are. Anyhow, also I should point out for you here that understanding politics and government is not a tangent from self-actualization. This will help you to understand yourself and people. In fact, what we're talking about when we're talking about government is we're talking about how to be in communion with other living beings at a sort of superorganism level. That's really what we're talking about. We're not just talking about abortion rights or racism or tax policy. I mean, this is all nitty-gritty stuff. We'll get to that, but you need to learn how to commune with other living beings on a massive scale. Nobody has taught you this, you see? And so as you learn the principles of proper communion, then that's going to help you within your local community. It's going to help you within your business and corporation because you have team members there. It's going to help you even in your family because really the problems you face in your family, you have political problems in your family, don't you? Of course you do. Those same problems exist on higher orders of organizations. It's just that scaled up by hundreds of millions. And then you see how difficult it is. So don't think of this as some sort of tangential topic. This is self-actualization. Human beings, we are social ape creatures. We are self-actualizing in a social matrix, you see? And culture and collective ego, these are huge forces that shape our lives. Very much, they shape our egos, they shape our identities. So as you study the principles of conscious politics and government in the world, after you're done with this series, you're going to see that's going to help you to deeper understand yourself. And as you understand yourself deeper and your own devilish ways, all your egotism and all the stuff that you're going to be self-actualizing and purifying out of you through the spiritual path, as you do that, you will gain insights into what makes other people so bad at politics and government. And then everything will come together and you'll understand. So here's the key, perhaps the most important thing I want you to take away from this episode. Your level of consciousness and development dictates your values, your morals, and therefore your politics. That's really the thing that's running the show. So at this point, my political, or rather, my understanding of consciousness and human development has become so deep that I can just look at someone on television, on CNN or Fox News or whatever, and just look at the politics that they're spewing or the morality that they have, and I can quickly identify what value system they're coming from, and I can quickly see that all they are is just a zombie or a robot parroting away, running off a script with their ideology, whether left or right or whatever. People vote simplistically for whoever they resonate with. A lot of times you see people on TV, pundits and analysts, debating endlessly about, how could this person have voted for that person? And how could this policy have passed? And they're surprised by these things. There's nothing surprising about it at all. And there's nothing very sophisticated about it at all. It's actually very simple. Whatever your level of consciousness and your level of development, that dictates your values, and then therefore you will vote for that level of person. It's as simple as that. Nothing else matters. Gun rights, abortion rights, this, that, that's all nonsense. What determines who you vote for is your set of values, and your set of values changes depending on what stage of development and consciousness you're at. We'll talk about the stages here in a moment. Everything else is just a retroactive rationalization that your ego mind comes up with. Pretty stories that you tell yourself and reasons and and logic and facts and all this. These are just arbitrary justifications that you create after the fact to justify why you voted for someone or why you like some politician. So what I'm telling you here is that a person who is at a certain level of consciousness or development and values certain things like nationalism, for example, they're going to vote for a nationalistic person. They're going to look at all the candidates out in the field, whether Democrats or Republicans, and this is all going to happen unconsciously, but they're going to look and they're going to see, who do I resonate with? It's sort of like a feeling thing. Who do I resonate with? And the one you're going to resonate with is the exact guy or woman who has the same level of consciousness and values that you have. So if you're a nationalist, you're going to resonate with a nationalist. If you're a hippie, you're going to resonate with a hippie. If you're a corporate CEO, you're going to resonate with a corporate CEO-minded type of person who shares your set of values. It's literally this simple. It's like the simplest thing. There's no mystery to it. See? And then what you tell yourself about why you chose somebody, that you have to be very, very suspicious of. That doesn't matter. Because your entire life is lived from your state of consciousness and your level of development. This isn't just politics. This is also how you show up in your relationships, how you show up at work, how you think about money, how you think about sex. All of this is governed by these more fundamental structures of your own psyche. See, but of course, nobody is really conscious of these structures. So to them, it's just a mystery of, who to vote for and why people vote and all this sort of stuff. Actually, it's extremely simple. Also, I want you to notice that your political ideology, whatever it happens to be, left or right or center, is a survival strategy of yours. I want you to notice that. It has nothing to do with the truth. You tell yourself that your politics is based in truth, but actually it isn't. That's sort of a little bit of a rude awakening that I want you to experience here. Remember, we're going meta beyond ideologies. You were indoctrinated into your political positions. If you just go and you analyze how you arrived at your political ideology, where did it come from? Whether you're conservative or liberal, it came from early childhood and teenage upbringing within your family and your culture and your colleagues and coworkers. And they just indoctrinated you with various ideas. Of course, this happened and you were willing to go along with it. And that's where your political ideology comes from. You didn't do anything intelligent. You didn't actually bother to sit down and think for yourself and arrive at some positions on abortion and gun rights and this and that. You didn't do any of this. You just absorbed it from your culture. And whatever the status quo of your culture is, that's what you picked up. And if you grew up in a conservative family, chances are you hold conservative ideologies. And if you grew up in a liberal family, you hold liberal ideologies. Notice this. Notice it. Remember when I talked about what survival is in my two-part series, Understanding Survival? I said that survival is not just about surviving your physical body. First and foremost, survival is about maintaining your identity. And that ideology, remember I said, your worldview is like an operating system which governs everything you do and all of your motivations and all of your actions and behaviors in all the various contexts of life, right? So that's what we're talking about here. The reason people get so attached to their political ideologies and they don't want to give it up, and they get so emotional about it and so defensive about it, is precisely because when we're talking about changing or questioning one's political ideology, we're talking about changing fundamental features of one's worldview, which is something the ego mind does not want to give up, because to admit that parts of its worldview are wrong is very, very threatening. That's a slippery slope that it doesn't want to go down, because that opens Pandora's box to much greater existential crises and problems that we don't want to even get into here. See? So people, of course, get very defensive about their worldview, which is why religion, politics, sexuality, these are some of the most controversial topics that exist. And it's very difficult to have serious substantive conversations about these precisely because people dig in their heels. And the trick is they don't want to explore different worldviews. So what I'm inviting you to do here is to drop all of your ideologies, whatever they are, and to sort of start to think from scratch, rethink everything. Be very mindful of how you're just executing a script. You're just being a zombie here, a selfish zombie. You're not being intelligent. Culture plays a huge role in maintaining the status quo of government and society. 99% of people never think for themselves. Their ideas are absorbed from culture. This is true even of serious intellectuals and scientists. It's extremely difficult to break out of the cultural matrix that you grew up in. And politics and government cannot evolve until culture evolves. So it's a tricky catch-22 because, of course, the powerful and the most selfish people who have the most power in the culture and in society precisely put up obstacles to changing the culture. They don't want the culture to evolve because to them, that is tantamount to death. If the culture evolves, the political structure will evolve. If the political structure evolves, they risk losing their power. And since they're just blindly selfish, all they care about is maintaining their power, because maintaining their power is how they survive, how they reproduce, how they pass off their resources to their offspring and ensure that their offspring do the same. That's really what this is about. And who gets to decide in which direction culture should evolve? Which is the right direction? You see the problem here? Everyone has their own opinions, and hence we get to the culture wars. And the force of the status quo that is preserving existing culture is extremely strong. Extremely strong. Most people in countries around the world are attached to their culture and to their way of life, and they don't want change. They don't like change. And so this is what we're dealing with here. So the majority of people are going to resist any kind of change or even any kind of discussion about change. Necessarily so, because they're afraid of what that leads to. What does the change mean for me and for my family? They're worried, they're scared. I also want you to understand that logic, reason, and facts have been co-opted by the ego. Logic and reason are survival and selfishness, not truth. So whatever logic or science that you use to rationalize your political ideology, understand that this is backwards rationalization. You're not actually believing the things you believe because they're logical or reasonable, or because of the facts or the statistics, or because of science. You use all of those to entrench your existing positions, which were adopted blindly on blind faith, not based on any kind of reason, logic, or facts. Be very mindful of that trick that the mind plays. Now, here's an important distinction that I want you to make that'll help you out. There's a difference between content versus structure. Content versus structure. Content is the specific content of your beliefs. People get hung up on this stuff. Like, content would be, for example, are you a Muslim, or are you a Christian, or are you a Jew, or are you an atheist? Or do you believe we should ban assault weapons in the United States? Or do you believe that we shouldn't? These are content-based disagreements. People get caught up on these. This is not what's important. What's important is the structure. The structure is the underlying cognition that you're using to think about the content. It's how your mind works behind the scenes that you're not aware of. It's the very fact that you're holding these beliefs without recognizing that they're beliefs or ideologies or where they came from, or the fact that you're just executing the script. That is the deeper structure. And the most important piece of structure that we're going to be talking about at length here right now that determines all political actions and motivations and opinions is the sense of self and other that you have. What is your sense of self and what is your sense of other? That's the key. That is so key. Most people just assume that, well, my sense of self is just me, my body, and then the other is just everything else. It's not so simple. sense of self is an elastic notion, as is the sense of other. So we're going to explore this in a moment here. This is a matter of how big is your circle of concern. And here we need to talk about developmental psychology and specifically stages of moral development. Researchers and psychologists over the last 50 years have done some good, serious research into how morality develops within human beings. And what they found is that there's a consistent ladder of steps that people go up as they grow and they mature. So here are some of these steps. We're going to be talking about now from going from the smallest circle of concern, smallest, most condensed sense of self, to an expanding, ultimately universal sense of self and circle of concern. So first we start off with the way that a baby is born into the world. It's just my physical survival. It's the smallest circle of concern you can have. At this point, you don't even care about your family. You don't care about your parents. You don't care about your friends because you basically don't have any friends. And your family, you don't even recognize them as your family. It's just like a little toddler who needs his milk. Otherwise, he cries, right? That's all he cares about. He doesn't even care about what happens to his mother. He just needs what he needs to live. It's a very primitive form of existence. And this is how animals live as well. Animals mostly just care about their own physical survival. Many animals, for example, will actually cannibalize their own kind. They will even cannibalize their young in order to personally, physically survive. And that's just a very crude form of survival, that we had to go through as life forms to get to where we are today. Then your circle of concern expands some more as you grow up. And now it's not just me personally, but of course you have to include your family as well. And usually also you have to start to include your tribe as well, because you don't just grow up in a family outside of a tribe. This has never been the case in human civilization until maybe just now in the 21st century. Well, we always had a tribe. So now I care about myself, my family, and my tribe. And I care, I really care. If someone in my family gets hurt or injured, I actually empathize with them and I want to help them. And if they need help, I will gladly lend a hand. But not to some other family, only to my own family, because my own family is mine and that other family is some other family. What do I have to do with them? Likewise, I will chip in for my tribe, but I won't chip in for the neighboring tribe because they're not my tribe. And that's my sense of self and my sense of circle of concern. Then that grows to include me, my family, but also now my civilization, because we're going beyond tribes. We've evolved to civilization. So now my civilization, my ethnic group, my culture, my religion, my morality, and my country. All of that. This is the level of moral development that many conservatives are at right here. This is how they form their entire identity around their family, their civilization, their ethnic group, their moral system passed down from their religion, and their culture and their country. And this is held to be the best, and everything else is expendable. It's not mine. That other country, that other culture, that other civilization, it has nothing to do with me. That's how they think. Then you grow a little bit more, and your circle of concern expands to all decent human beings on the planet, all races, all cultures, but not the bad guys, not the evil people, not the criminals, not the ones who would oppress the innocent. Your circle of concern does not expand to those. Those you hold as expendable because they're bad in your mind. But all decent people, regardless of what country they live in, you have empathy for. Then your circle of concern expands even more as you become more conscious and more developed. And now you start to care about all human beings on the entire planet, good or bad, including the evil ones, the criminal ones, and even the ones who would oppress the innocent. You even have empathy for them because you recognize that they too are human, and many of the most monstrous people on the planet, actually, there's a really good reason for why they are that way, because they were abused as children, or they grew up in a very impoverished environment, or they had terrible tragedies like their family died when they were young, or they were indoctrinated into some kind of cult or some sort of terrorist organization. So you start to see that, it's not really their fault. I can see why they went down that road. And if If not for me being a little bit lucky, being born in the right circumstances, in the right family, and being raised properly, I too could have gone down that road. And so, I see, I have empathy for them now too. Then your circle of concern expands even more to include now not just humans, but animals and the environment. You care about the entire planet as an ecosystem. This is called Gaia, planet Earth as a superorganism. You care about the future of the entire planet, not just for your selfish needs. It's not like, I care about the planet because I don't want my children to live in a burning hell. But I actually care about just the well-being of the planet itself and all the animals that live on it. Then your circle of concern expands even further to include all conscious beings in the entire universe, not just this planet. And then lastly, your circle of concern becomes infinite. Your sense of self becomes infinite, and you care about all of creation, whether it's living or non-living, in this dimension, in some other dimension, in the past, in the future, at all times. All of it is something you identify with, and all of it is something you empathize with and care for and want the best for. So try to peg yourself. Where are you, honestly, where are you on this scale of moral development? Understand, though, that if you're at a lower level, this doesn't mean you're an evil person. It just means you're at that level. So I'm not judging you for being whatever level you're at. Just be honest with yourself and don't judge yourself either. Also understand that there's going to be a problem here, is that if your level is too low, you're not going to even want to accept that there are these levels. You see? Because some people listening to me here, if they're at a low level, they'll say, Leo, but why should I care about the animals and the environment? This is some hippie bullshit, some new age nonsense, all conscious beings in you. What are you talking about? This is fairy tales and wishful thinking. I mean, I can understand maybe caring for all human beings, but are you serious caring about animals and the environment? This is silly. Yeah, that you're speaking from, notice that you're speaking from your current stage of consciousness and moral development. That's how you feel. And you honestly feel that way. And you can't understand why someone would care about living beings on another planet. To you, it makes no sense because you haven't evolved to that level yet. You see, so the trick here is that it's hard to take seriously any level which is several stages above your current level. Because if you could understand it and you would accept it seriously, then you would already be there, you see. So keep that in mind. So the reason we get such bad politics is because most of the citizens who vote have a very small, narrow circle of concern. And most of mankind is at a very primitive level of moral development. Over 50% of the planet are at the level where they have their circle of concern includes them, their family, and their civilization, their ethnic group, and their personal religion and country, and nothing else. That's where 50% of the globe is at right now. See, so it's not very sophisticated. Also, I should tell you about Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development. Lawrence Kohlberg is a developmental psychologist from the University of Chicago, if I recall correctly. And he did some groundbreaking research by analyzing people and how they evolve as they mature. And he found the following 6 stages of moral development. Really, he broke it up into three parts. So first, you have the pre-conventional, then the conventional, and then the post-conventional. So each of these 3 parts has 2 stages in it. So stage 1, pre-conventional, is as follows. Morality is based upon obedience and a punishment orientation, which basically means extremely selfish. How can I avoid punishment? That's what the person cares about. So the reason that they're moral is because they want to avoid personal punishment and suffering. You know, it's a very selfish way to be moral. Then you evolve beyond that to stage 2, which is now a self-interested orientation, where now, instead of avoiding punishment, it's a question of what's in it for me. So I'll be good as long as there's something in it for me. Like, I'll be good if you pay me some money. That sort of thinking. Then you evolve beyond that and you get into the conventional stage. Conventional, stage 3, is interpersonal accord and conformity. Now the person is motivated to be a good boy or a good girl, and to have some authority figure think of them as a good boy or as a good girl. And they get a sense of achievement out of being that good boy or that good girl, and that is what motivates them to be moral. So they're not really doing it because they believe it's right per se. They're doing it because some authority figure told them to, and they want to conform to what the authority figure told them, and they want the approval and love of the authority figure. See? Then you evolve beyond that to stage 4, which is now authority and social order maintenance. This is a law and order morality. You conform to the laws of your culture and your civilization, and you accept them unquestioningly as the one true right way. And you believe that they are absolute because they're passed down by God or some other authority figure. And it never really even occurs to you to question law and order. It just is what it is. And it's always been this way. That's how you think. And so you just follow and you conform, and you don't skirt the rules. And then finally, you get to the post-conventional stage, stage 5, which is the social contract orientation. Here, you start to see that there's like a social contract that we all sort of sign up for when we're born, and we want to participate in that. And that morality is not based in religion or in God, but rather in social contract theory. And it's really about maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number of people, sort of a utilitarian philosophy. Then the next stage after that is stage 6. This is called universal ethical principles. Here now you start to think critically for yourself. This is like the morality of Immanuel Kant. You think critically for yourself, and you try to behave in such a way that you're a good citizen within your society. And you try to follow your own principles, you set your own principles. And here, at this level of morality, you can actually question government laws because you don't take them as absolutes. Here, you can look at some government law and you can say, well, you know what? That part in the Constitution where it says that black people aren't even people, but just like 3/5 of a person, or whatever that number was, the ratio that used to be there, we can question that. That doesn't seem right to me because I have my own internally grounded ethical principles, and it doesn't seem right to me that black people should not count as a full person. So I'm going to question that, and I'm going to stand up for what should be right. I have my own internal sense of justice and propriety. And so I can now question and change those laws based on what my heart tells me rather than what the book says. It doesn't matter what the book says. It doesn't matter what the Constitution says. We can rewrite the Constitution because the Constitution was written by men. And how did they come up with it? Well, they followed their hearts or their own reasoning, supposedly, right? That's how this type of person thinks. And then lastly, there's a final stage, which Kohlberg didn't even get to because he himself wasn't developed enough, and it was hard for him to gather the empirical evidence for it. But I'm telling you right now, it's there because I'm there. It's transcendent morality. We could call this stage 7. Universal self-love. This is when your sense of self, through mystical experience and enlightenment, becomes so great that it literally becomes infinite, and you become conscious of the substance of the entire universe as consciousness and love. And therefore, you love the entire universe because you realize that it's all a product of your own mind. This is a very radical, very advanced level of morality that less than 1% of the population has ever tapped into or even understands exists. So there you go. So this explains a lot about how people act with politics and with government, is because most of them are at a conventional, not even a post-conventional, but at a conventional level of morality, where they're mostly just conforming to various kinds of authority figures that came in the past. They're not thinking critically about these things at all. So their ideology is based on that, and their politics is based on that. Now, let me give you an example with abortion here about how this morality stuff works. So my claim is the reason that we put these as numbered stages, each stage builds on top of the previous stage, is because what happens is that it's not just that these are different random categories and a person just either accepts stage 1 or stage 5 or stage 7 just willy-nilly. It's not how it works. You evolve through it by developing your sense of self, by expanding it, by becoming more conscious. So the claim is that you start off at the bottom and you move towards the top. Now, most people don't make it very far towards the top. They stop somewhere in the middle. They usually stop roughly at the center of gravity of their culture or their family that they grew up in. But the reason we can say that the higher stages are more advanced and more developed and more conscious is precisely because once you evolve to them, you will never evolve backwards. And they go in a consistent order. So, for example, with abortion, and this is just one example, the first stage of morality of abortion is something like this. You ask a person at this stage, is abortion right or wrong? And they'll just tell you, fuck you, I'll do whatever the fuck I want. You don't get to tell me what to do. Stage 2, you ask a person, is abortion right or wrong? And they say, abortion is definitely evil because God says so. My Bible says so. And you can't question the Bible because it's the absolute truth. Then that person evolves further if they keep growing and expanding their consciousness. If they keep doing self-actualization work, they will evolve to the next stage where you ask them, is abortion right or wrong? And they will say, well, it's complicated. We need to balance the suffering of the fetus versus the suffering of the mother. Because clearly there are instances where abortion can be abused. So we don't want to just give everybody free reign of abortion, all the way up until the final day of the abortion, just willy-nilly aborting, 9-month-old fetuses. This would be cruel and it would create unnecessary suffering. But on the other hand, we also have to take the serious complications that mothers have during labor and during childbirth. All of this needs to be taken into account during pregnancy. It's complicated. We've got to take rape into account. We've got to take incest into account, all of these complexities. And, we have to weigh the pros and cons and the relative suffering of the mother versus the fetus. Because, if the fetus is only like a clump of cells, not even a fetus yet, and it's only a month old, it doesn't even have a heart, doesn't have a brain, does it really suffer? Doesn't seem like it suffers that much. So in this case, the suffering of the mother, if the mother's life is in danger or something like that, then sure, we allow the mother to do what she needs to do. But once you get to a certain point where it develops a heart and a brain, and you can tell that it's capable of suffering, now the situation starts to tip in favor of the fetus rather than the mother's wishes and desires. And so, see, it's a very nuanced position about abortion. So my claim is that once you evolve to this nuanced position, you will never go backwards to believing that abortion is evil because God says so. Nor will you ever go backwards to the point where you say, well, fuck it, I'll just do whatever I want. See? In this way, we say that certain stages are more evolved and developed than others. Because the thing with expanding your consciousness is that once it expands to a certain level, it never contracts all the way back. Now, of course, you can have temporary contractions, and when you're just pushing to expand it, it can contract back. But once you kind of really expand it permanently, it never fully ever contracts back. So the key to understanding all politics is these stages of moral and also ego development. It's not just that morality develops through stages, but the ego develops through stages. And here I'll point you to a researcher, a Harvard-educated developmental psychologist by the name of Susan Cook-Greuter. Cook-Greuter. It's a weird last name. But she did some amazing research, and she has 9 stages of ego development that egos go through. I'm not going to go into the details of that. It's too complicated and technical, but just be aware of that. And I posted on my blog, actually, one of her research papers. It's like a 100-page research paper, which talks about the various stages of ego development. So the reason I'm giving you this is because I want you to see that what I'm talking about here is not just my own personal preferences and biases. I'm talking about serious scientific research that's been done. In fact, in the future, I will do a whole episode called Developmental Psychology, which will list about 8 different developmental psychologists, reputable ones from top universities that have been doing research for the last 50 years on this stuff. And you'll see a lot of convergence, and it'll really build on top of the stuff we've talked about with spiral dynamics. So the key here about ego development is that it's all about how selfish you are. The more developed your ego is, the less selfish you are. The less developed your ego is, the more selfish you are. The more selfish you are, the more you are motivated by greed, fear, ignorance, hatred, bias. The more closed-minded you are, the more prone you are to denial, projection, blaming, and division, and the more dogmatic and the more ideological you are. And when you are that way, you vote for those types of leaders. You vote for the leader who most reflects who you are. You see? So if you're a racist, you're going to vote for racist leaders. If you're a hippie, you're going to vote for hippie leaders, and so forth. The trick to conscious politics is stepping outside of one's identity. There cannot be conscious politics without expanding your sense of identity. That's what it all boils down to. Because the more expanded your identity, the more capable you are of universal love. And that is the thing that we will need to resolve all of the tricky problems of self-dealing that make politics so dirty and problematic. See? When selfish people do politics, it becomes very ugly. It becomes name-calling, factions and rivalries, and ultimately violence and genocide. When selfless people engage in politics, they can resolve all sorts of problems without violence, without name-calling. They can be adults rather than children. So that's what we're working towards here. So how do we fix all the problems with government? Firstly, by taking personal responsibility for them. Secondly, by educating yourself about the problems. Many of these problems are complicated and require study. Thirdly, by expanding your sense of self, consciousness, and your capacity to love, which is something you do through personal development work, through consciousness work, through spiritual work. By purifying yourself of your devilry. That's how you stop being a devil. See, it's really simple. You want good politics? Stop being a devil. Be an example for others of how not to be a devil, and then they will also not want to be devils around you because they'll see your example. And so as you do all this, you become a better citizen and a better leader within your community. And then this creates an upward spiral where everyone starts doing the same thing. And then we have a beautiful society. And to the extent that we don't do this is to the extent that we have a evil society where it's selfish and vicious and oppressive and unfair and violent. And it's nasty to the point where nobody wants to live in such a society. You want to run away. And see, suddenly now you see why government is so screwed up, because nobody wants to do the hard work of actually expanding their sense of self and their capacity to love. This is hard to do. All the self-actualization stuff that you've been doing over the years while following me, you guys who've been doing it, and you girls, you know how difficult it is. See, it's filled with pain and suffering and, overcoming your own ego and, rude awakenings and ego backlashes, all this. Most people aren't interested in any of that. Instead, what they're interested in is just ideological debates, because when they're engaging in ideological debates, this allows them to blame everybody else except themselves. Therefore, they never have to turn inwards. They never have to do any inner work. They don't have to grow. They don't have to change. They don't have to improve as a human being. They don't have to raise their capacity to love. They don't have to question their culture or their religion or their family. They can just comfortably fit in and execute a script. This is it. It's this simple. It really is this simple. But notice this is not talked about anywhere on television or in the political analysis. Nowhere is this talked about. As simple and as obvious as it is. Once you understand what I'm talking about here, it's going to be so obvious. You're going to be like, of course, this is the answer. Of course, this is the root problem of why government is so corrupt. See, one of the hallmarks of conscious people is that they take responsibility for everything. They don't blame, they don't deny, they don't project, they don't ignore, and they don't divide. They don't sweep problems under the rug. They take responsibility for them and they become proactive about it. Notice that all of low consciousness politics, often that you see on TV and YouTube, tries to blame somebody else. It really is this simple. You can identify what political ideology someone has simply by asking them who's responsible for all the problems in the world, and they will have a scapegoat for you. So who's being blamed? Either immigrants or minorities, women or feminists, terrorists or Muslims, globalists or Jews, reptilians, Russia, North Korea, Iran, various dictators around the world, or who are blamed are just the politicians, the president, Congress. Republicans or Democrats are blamed. The gays are blamed. Atheists are blamed. Theists are blamed. Religious nutcases are blamed. Communists and cultural Marxists are blamed. Corporations are blamed. The media is blamed. Racists are blamed. Who do you like to blame? If you're blaming somebody and you honestly believe that the world's problems would be resolved if we simply got rid of the racists or the gays or the communists or the Republicans or the Democrats or the globalists, you're kidding yourself. You're not operating from a place of high consciousness. Because if you were truly conscious, your sense of self would be so expanded that you would understand that all of this, all of these various groups and factions that are fighting for power and control, that are acting selfishly. And by the way, I'm not excusing any of these people from not contributing to the problem. They certainly, all of them contribute to the problem in their own respective ways. But, also to various degrees. So I'm not creating false equivalencies here. I'm not saying that gays are the same as racists. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that if you were conscious, your sense of self would be so expanded that you would realize that this is just the cards that humanity has been dealt. We are collectively evolving through some complex stuff, trying to survive on this rock which is spinning around the sun at thousands of miles a minute. You see, in the larger scheme of things, that's what's happening here. And building a society is a very difficult thing, and people have different agendas, and people are at different levels of development, and so you can't really blame anybody here. And so a conscious person would take responsibility for the devilry of his or her government. And that's exactly what's missing today in our political discussions. Nobody wants to take responsibility for the devilry that their government commits. Sure, everybody loves to blame government and the politicians for being corrupt and evil in all this. But the truth is, they're only as corrupt and evil as the people who elected them. And you are directly responsible for what they are doing. That's how democracy works. Human rights abuses, oppression, and war is your responsibility. If your government is waging war, you are responsible for that war. Whatever human rights abuses and torture that your government is doing, you're responsible for it. And if you say, no, I'm not, Leo, I didn't vote at all, there you go. You're responsible. By not voting, you're responsible. By not making a choice, by being lazy, by being ignorant, you create the status quo. You maintain the status quo, which is generally oppressive, abusive, and warlike. See? Now, I'm not blaming you per se. Responsibility is a much broader notion than blame. See my episode blame versus responsibility. I'm not saying you're a bad or evil person by saying that you need to be responsible for the devilry of your government. I'm just saying be responsible. Realize that you have some say in what your government does. Even if you live in a country, you might say, well, Leo, but I live in a country where I don't even get to vote, so how am I responsible? The government just decides without my even able to do anything about it. You can do something about it. How do you think countries that have the right to vote got the right to vote? Because they didn't have it originally. No country was started with the right to vote. And certainly not a universal right to vote for women and lower class people and for black people and minorities. No, it didn't work that way. Even in America, this wasn't the case. In America, the right to vote was reserved for the most elite land-owning rich people who were also white and men. So how do you think the rest of them got the right to vote? By standing up, by taking responsibility for it. And the way that America was founded, our founding fathers, the way that they got the right to vote, even for the rich white men of this country, is by waging a revolutionary war against some king in England. See? So only when you take responsibility are you able to really challenge and change government. What I'm telling you here is something that you don't want to hear. I'm telling you that you are responsible for the Iraq War. You are responsible for nuclear weapons. You are responsible for immigration problems. You are responsible for the corruption of government. You are responsible for corporate lobbying and Wall Street shenanigans. You are responsible for Donald Trump, even if you didn't vote for him. You are responsible for terrorism. You are responsible for overfishing. You are responsible for pollution. You are responsible for partisanship. You are responsible for racism, even if you don't consider yourself to be a racist. This would be a position that a conscious person acknowledges. If you're not a conscious person, you're going to deny your responsibility for these things. You're going to come up with excuses such as well, Leo, I'm not a racist, so how am I responsible for racism? But you're part of a larger society. Racists aren't some evil people that are living somewhere else. Racists are your neighbors, part of your society, your friends. And if we look at it from an even bigger picture perspective, they are part of your consciousness. They are part of the entire universe, which is identical with yourself. But now we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. All right? So you're responsible for all this stuff. When you start to see it that way, your whole attitude changes. You stop blaming and you start looking for solutions. You start being understanding towards those people who you thought were evil, who you spent time blaming. And you see that blaming didn't solve anything. It only contributed to the problems because you blame them, they blame you, and then nothing happens. Nothing changes. When you take responsibility for these things, then you can become a great leader. For example, if you took responsibility for leadership, you might say, for racism, you might say, well, I'm not a racist, but what am I doing to help change people who are racist? How do I reach out to them? How do I convince them? Maybe I can start a school. Maybe I can start a YouTube channel. Maybe I can write a book. Maybe I can go talk to politicians. Maybe I can become a politician. Maybe I can give an inspiring speech. And then through this, you can change the situation. You can't change the situation by sitting around and blaming others. Here are a few low consciousness political behaviors that I want you to be very cognizant of because you might be engaging in these. Number one, trying to own or ridicule your opponents. High consciousness people do not do this. Number two, taking glee in the suffering of your opponents. So if you see a Democrat suffer and you're a Republican and that makes you happy that that's happening, or vice versa, if you're a Democrat and you see a Republican suffering and that makes you happy, just know that that's a low consciousness behavior. You see, the reason that you're happy at the suffering of your opponents is because you've separated yourself from your opponents, and your sense of self is so contracted that it doesn't include your opponents. If your sense of self expanded further, it would include your opponents, and therefore, even though they're your opponents, you might disagree with them, you're not happy that they suffer. You feel compassion for them. You understand that they suffer out of their own ignorance, and you would like to help them, but of course, not everybody will allow themselves to be helped. And you understand that, but you don't take joy in seeing them suffer, even if they're deeply ignorant and unconscious. Because you understand that at one point in your life, you too were deeply ignorant and unconscious. See? Number 3, holding an intellectual position as an absolute. Conscious people don't do that. Not acknowledging that your perspective or point of view is a point of view. Conscious people don't do that. Unconscious people do that. Unconscious people deny that their point of view is a point of view. They tend to hold it as an absolute. Next, scheming and manipulating to defeat your opponents. If you scheme and manipulate a lot to undermine your opponents, you're not a conscious person. If you demonize your opponents, you're not a conscious person. If you call your opponents crazy or insane, you're not a conscious person. Because when you call somebody crazy or insane, that means you're not interested in understanding their point of view. That's a defense mechanism, you see. And lastly, acting righteous. Beware of acting morally righteous. Conscious people do not act morally righteous. And with all these low consciousness political behaviors that I pointed out here, I'm not just saying this for the sake of civility. I'm talking about something substantive and something much deeper. I'm not just saying that, oh, we should all just get along and be nice to one another. That's not what I'm saying. It's not about being nice or being pleasant. Sometimes you do have to fight within politics. Sometimes you do have to stand up against people who are truly devils and want to do unconscious things. You do have to stand up. You don't just lay down and be a doormat. And you don't just be civil with them. You know, you don't just take Hitler out for dinner to a tea party. You know, you don't need to do that. That's not what I'm talking about. But you do have to be careful not to fall into the very same traps that make your opponents your opponents. And not to feed the downward spiral into unconsciousness. You see, this is very important. A lot of liberals make this mistake. They fall into the trap of thinking that, well, we're above the conservatives. We're more evolved than the conservatives. And so therefore now we can act morally righteous and we can demonize them and we can call them Nazis and racists and these sorts of things. And we can even be glad when they suffer and this sorts of stuff. This is not conscious behavior. Be careful with that. Even though you might be correct on individual policy positions, that doesn't mean you're acting like a conscious human being. You see, separate the structure of how you act and how you think from your individual policy positions, whatever you believe in. As a liberal, maybe you believe in Medicare for all, maybe you believe in socialism, maybe you believe in free healthcare or free college or whatever. These are fine, believe whatever policies you want, but separate that from the structure of your psyche and your ego. Ideology cannot prevent devilry. No ideology can. In fact, ideology is the primary tool of devilry. So changing your ideology from a conservative one to a liberal one is not going to do it. Morality cannot prevent devilry. No system of codified moral codes can prevent devilry. Technology cannot prevent devilry. Some people have this fantasy. It's the sort of the techno-bro fantasy that if only we have enough technological innovation, we have robots and machines, we have the digital singularity, and we have Elon Musk who becomes our overlord and solves all our problems through technology, that this way we will solve the problems of government and unconsciousness and devilry. No, it's not going to happen. Technology is co-opted by the devil. Notice this. Every new technology presents new problems. We invent nuclear weapons and then devils get a hold of them and then we have disaster. So technology is not going to do it. And in fact, some of the newest developments that are happening with, brain-computer interfaces and genetic engineering, cloning, this sorts of stuff, this is extremely dangerous stuff. And it's not going to solve our problems. It's going to make the problems even worse. First, we have to solve the devilry. Then that will create space for more technology. Regulation also can't prevent devilry. A devil is going to be the devil no matter what the regulations are, although, of course, regulations are necessary. The only thing that prevents devilry is expanding your sense of self. In other words, stop being a fucking devil. That's how you stop devilry. Spiritual development is necessary. Spiritual work to prevent devilry. And here we run into one of the key problems right now in our stage orange, spiral dynamic stage orange society, is the very notion of bringing spiritual development into politics or government, and to suggest that we cannot solve our government and politics problems unless everybody spiritually evolve and do spiritual work. That is a non-starter already. Because you're going to have the scientists and atheists and agnostics and so forth, whining and bitching and moaning about the fact that, no, Leo, you're creating a theocracy and you're forgetting about the separation of church and state. And what are you talking about? This spirituality is just a bunch of new age hippie bullshit, and it doesn't really solve anything. It's impractical. See, yeah, with that kind of attitude, because people are so ignorant about what spirituality is, we're stuck. We're stuck with devilry then. Stage orange devilry. Capitalist devilry. That's what we have right now. I want you to really understand that political discourse in our culture and media is happening at just a barbaric, childish level. Childishness, that's what it is. It's children throwing food at each other. That's what our politics is right now. None of the real issues are being talked about. That's the real tragedy of all this. Really, what I'm talking about here should be talked about on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC every single day. That's all they should be talking about. This is the shit Anderson Cooper should be talking about. What the fuck is he doing? Sorry, Anderson. But this is what you should be talking about, dude. Not like back and forth having Republicans and Democrats bicker with each other about some nonsense tweet that Donald Trump made last night. That's not going to move us forward. But on the other hand, I understand why he does what he does, because he's in a certain corporate system. And the stuff that I'm talking about here, it takes hours to talk about. You can't have a 3-minute soundbite about these things. This is serious. This is serious work. But then again, how else do you expect serious problems to get solved other than through serious work? Serious, careful, critical thinking, study, self-analysis, self-reflection. People in our culture are deeply ignorant about government and politics. This right here contributes to at least 50% of all of our problems. Simply this, a lack of education, study, and contemplation. And I'm not even talking about advanced ideas about non-duality or about even conscious politics as I'm talking about here. I'm not even less than 1% of our population will even reach this stage to be able to understand what I'm saying in this set of episodes. I'm just talking about extremely basic education. Most people have no sense of political history, about Nazism, about McCarthyism, about slavery, about racism, about other nations, about what government is like in Scandinavia, about what government is like in Africa, about how government evolved, about the Roman Empire, about the Egyptian Empire, about the Chinese Empire. Just these basic things. To be able to understand government and politics, you need a historical foundation. This is absolutely critical because history is filled with over 5,000 years of politics done in various vicious ways. And we can see the stuff that's worked and the stuff that hasn't worked. And by studying history, you start to appreciate where we are at today. Puts everything into context. See? But how many books have you read about political history since high school or the end of university? Whichever that was for you. If you didn't go to university, how many books of political history have you read since high school? 0, probably. For most people, the answer is 0. So of course you're ignorant about politics and government, and of course you're going to vote for the wrong people. Of course you're going to be easily seduced and misled by various kinds of fear-based ideologies, which are peddled as a business by various kinds of outlets on YouTube and on the TV, on cable. See, you got to read books. You can't understand this stuff without reading books, without studying these complex problems. And, our founding fathers were great students of Athens and ancient Greece and Rome and various kinds of political philosophies, cutting-edge political philosophies coming from Europe after the French Revolution. They studied all this stuff carefully, and they came up with principles and various kinds of rules of thumb about how to architect a better government, which will have safeguards against these various kinds of corruptions and problems that existed in other states for all of human history. They studied all that stuff, and then they came up with the Constitution, and that was a pretty epic achievement. But today, and of course they were elites, and in their time, they were the cream of the crop. They were the top 1%. In their time, most people were illiterate, so they had no idea what was really going on. But today, we have democracy. Today, everyone gets to vote, but people are so ignorant that what they vote for is ignorant stuff, thinking that what they're doing is being smart and intelligent. So this point about lack of proper education is central, and one of the key policy proposals I will have for you in the future episodes for fixing our politics and government is a much higher quality education across the board, which is free to everybody in the country. This is absolutely crucial. This is one of the highest leverage points that we have to transform the world, is to transform our education system. And there's so much we can do to improve our education system. But of course, it's never going to be that easy, because education therefore becomes a political powder keg. Changing education is one of the most difficult things, precisely because the devils who are in power, the most selfish and unconscious people who don't want culture to change, first and foremost, they don't want education to change. In fact, what they want to do is they want to roll back the clock on education. They want to take education backwards to teach their ideology. That's what the devil tries to do with education, because education is one of the key tools that mankind can use to awaken. So the devil needs to co-opt education and turn it into a source of spreading of devilry, indoctrination. And you see that with the Trump administration. Look who he put in charge of the education department. Betsy DeVos. She's trying to turn education backwards. That's what she's doing. This is not an accident. This is all by design. But of course, the people who are doing this, they're not conscious enough to understand what they're really doing. They think that what they're doing is actually going to be good for the country. But really what it is, it's good for the maintaining of the status quo. It's good for maintaining their ideology. They've confused what's good for their ideology with what's good for the country. These are two very different things. Let's move on here, and I want to point out another important thing for you. Make the following distinction. Any political policy or position can be criticized or analyzed from above or from below. Not just the left and the right, but from the above and from below. So, for example, religion. What's a criticism of religion from below? It's something like this. Religion these days is so degraded. Young people are not going to church. We're not even allowed to teach religion in the schools anymore. We're not allowed to bring Bibles to school anymore. You can't pray in schools anymore. This is all wrong. We need to bring Christianity back into the classroom. We need Bibles. We need to make Christianity the official state religion. This would be a criticism of religion from below. A criticism of religion from above would be something along the lines of religion is problematic in that it presents important truths about life and about human nature and about consciousness in a dogmatic and ideological way. It actually prevents its own ultimate purpose, which is to help to awaken people and to help them to expand their sense of self. So the way religion is practiced today oftentimes is that actually it contracts a person's sense of self rather than helping them to do the practices that are necessary, like meditation, contemplation, to grow themselves spiritually. See the difference in criticism there? So this is almost the case with any position. You can criticize it from below or from above. And oftentimes people make this sort of conflation where they hear a criticism from above and they misinterpret it as a criticism from below. Let's look at the example of science. A criticism of science from below is something like, well, science is problematic because, those scientists, they're godless atheists and they just have their materialist agenda. And the problem is that they don't understand God and they don't understand the importance of Christianity. And so they are missing something important. And so really what we need is we need to teach creationism alongside with evolution in the biology class. That's what we need. And, science is overstepping its bounds. And science is making people doubt God and doubt religion and doubt the Bible. This is all very bad. That's a criticism from below. A criticism of science from above, which is often how I criticize science, is that science is locked into the materialist paradigm. And as important as science is, there are serious limits to science as an epistemic method. Science is overlooking important aspects of spirituality and mysticism because it's locked into the materialist paradigm and it's trying to quantify everything and explain everything through formulas and through mathematics, which simply can't be done if you're trying to understand the deepest levels of reality. Can't do it that way, and science is blind to some of those limitations. And also, science is stuck in groupthink. And science is not questioning various metaphysical assumptions that it holds as dogmas, which it doesn't recognize are dogmas. And if we could help science to overcome these limitations, science would become much better, but also it would free people up to pursue spirituality more, and therefore actually be a net benefit for all of civilization and science itself as well, because the best scientists are actually reaching right up to the point of being mystics. So you see, a very different kind of criticism. Likewise, you can criticize socialism from above or from below. A criticism of socialism from below is a very common one you hear, for example, on Fox News, is something like, oh, those socialists, they're really just communists. They just want to seize all of the money and they just want to redistribute it and turn us into Venezuela. That's what they want to do. And they want to take away all our rights. They want to oppress us and they just want a big government rule. That's all they want to do. And they're evil. And they're anti-American. A criticism of socialism from above would be something along the lines of, if we give workers in a corporation the power to vote and to actually have ownership of that corporation in the sort of Marxian ideal, there's a sort of problem which Marx and many socialists don't take seriously, which is that if a corporation is truly run by committee, by the average of all the workers, rather than by some really ambitious, passionate founder or CEO who has a vision for this corporation, then there's a serious risk that the corporation will be run into the ground through a sort of rule by committee. And rule by committee doesn't have a sense of direction or sense of vision, and therefore a lot of businesses will actually become less productive and will ultimately fail, which will sort of backfire on the workers of that corporation. So many of the workers in the corporation, and many socialists and Marxists, don't understand the importance of the vision that the founder of the corporation presents and the direction he sets for the corporation, which makes that corporation successful. So, for example, if you remove Elon Musk from SpaceX or from Tesla, or if you remove Steve Jobs, of course he's passed now, but the loss of Steve Jobs, that was a significant to the significant detriment of Apple, because it was his vision that ultimately led Apple to become the powerhouse corporation that it is today. Without his vision, it probably wouldn't have happened. See? So if Apple is just run by committee, if every Apple Genius Bar employee just gets a vote in how to run Apple, is that really going to produce the best products, or is it going to produce kind of middling products with no vision? See? So that's a very different quality of criticism of socialism. So it's not that socialism is bad or evil, it's a question of nuance. See, your criticisms of these issues, almost anything can be criticized, but it has to be criticized with the proper nuance, from above, not from below. And what we mean by the difference between below and above is simply how conscious is your criticism. That's what distinguishes whether it's below or above. It's not about left and right. You might say, oh, Leo, but you're just being a leftist here because it seems like you're in favor of socialism. You're more gentle on socialism than the criticism from below, from Fox News. That's because you're trying to analyze this situation from a left-right perspective. And I'm telling you that's the wrong way to think about the situation. In fact, this brings us to the more general point that I want to make here, which is that to do politics properly, you have to throw away these simplistic dichotomies of left versus right, individual versus collective, capitalist versus socialist, religion versus science, small government versus large government, freedom versus regulation, majority rule versus minority rule, masculine versus feminine. To select one of these at the cost of the other is a trap and a mistake. Rather, what you should be asking in all these situations is it low or is it high? Not whether it's left or right, or capitalist or socialist. Is it low consciousness or high consciousness? Is it something that's coming from fear and selfishness and a small circle of concern? Or is it a position that's coming from an expanded sense of self, which includes everybody, a universal sense of self and love? That's what matters. And then let the chips fall where they may. If a universal sense of expanded identity and love leads you to concluding that we should be socialists, then we'll be socialists. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case. I'm just saying if, right? If. And if an expanded sense of self and universal love leads you to conclude that we need more femininity in our culture and that we need more females in government, then that's what you go with, femininity. Not because you're pro-femininity or you're anti-masculinity or you're pro-black people but you're anti-white people, not because of these things, but because your expanded sense of self And love has shown you the proper way. That's how you adjudicate all of these policy issues and debates. Now let's talk some more about developmental psychology, and let's return to spiral dynamics. I hope you've watched my multi-part series on spiral dynamics. I'm not going to, of course, recap all of it here. I want to specifically focus on the political evolution that we see within spiral dynamics. So just like with moral development, there were stages. There are also stages of government development or social development that we see throughout history, and this has been well documented through various research that you can go read about. Read the book, Spiral Dynamics, if you want to know more. But here I'll give you the political essence of it. So basically, human government thousands of years ago started out before there were major civilizations at stage purple, which was the tribal stage. At this stage, these are tribes of hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people at most. There is no serious government. There's no formal law system. There's no legal system. There's no court system. There might be a leader of the tribe, but he's not a dictator per se. The tribe is actually very communistic. Examples of these sorts of tribal governments, and they still exist, are tribes in the Amazon, deep in the Amazon rainforest. There are tribes within Africa, tribes in Papua New Guinea, aboriginals in Australia, and certain very backwards, kind of underdeveloped nations like Afghanistan. A lot of their government and politics is stage purple tribalistic. And in this level of government, there's no real sense of individuality. You're working for your tribe. Your identity is enmeshed with your tribe. And there's a lot of tribal warfare. So it's not like these tribes live peacefully with one another in some sort of romantic ideal where it's like you have tribal people living in the Amazon and it's just like the Garden of Eden and everyone is happy and there's no government and so everything is great. No. These tribes are vicious. There's tribal warfare. They slaughter each other. They will wipe out neighboring tribes, so they're genocidal. They will also enslave neighboring tribes, so there is slavery at this level. This is not some libertarian ideal or anarchist ideal here. Then, from that, there's an evolution. As the society becomes larger into the thousands and tens of thousands, tribes no longer become sustainable. And so what happens is that because these tribes, they become large and they start to fight with one another, too much tribal warfare becomes so problematic that an authoritarian rises. Some big boss. This is stage red government. And he creates an empire by rallying and unifying all the tribes together, not through love and peace, but through conquest and enslavement and vicious brutality. Rape and pillage, razing entire cities to the ground, waging military campaigns. This form of government is authoritarian, totalitarian, and monarchic. A monarchy is built through conquest and raw power, raw physical power, masculine brutality. Women are oppressed in these societies because they're not strong. Examples of this include the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, North Korea, Russia, some elements of Russia right now, Saudi Arabia, some aspects of Mexico are still like this. The cartels and the mafias and all the corruption in Mexico, those aspects are like this. Of course, Mexico still has some democracy, so it's a little bit more evolved than just pure red, but you can see aspects of it there. For the most part, governments today in the 21st century, they cannot be purely red. They have to make at least some pretense of democracy. Otherwise, they're just unsustainable. We've outgrown pure monarchy and authoritarianism. It doesn't work because people have evolved culturally and morally to the point where they won't stand for a monarchy. After the monarchy plays itself out, then we move into the next level, which is stage blue. Stage blue is theocratic, ethno-state, isolationist, and nationalist. This is Nazi Germany. This is Iran, India, China, Brazil, Israel, Poland, and the rural South and rural aspects of the U.S. That's what I mean by rural South. This is a very kind of conformist stage where people are just interested in upholding their own civilization. They think their own civilization is best, and what they want to do is ideally create an ethno-state. That's what Nazism was about, creating an ethno-state. All the other, the ones who are not like us, we throw them out. But we build this massive civilization for ourselves. So it's sort of like tribalism, but on a grand civilizational scale. Now my tribe is my entire nation and my whole ethnicity. And so we will unify, Hitler was obsessed with unifying the German race as the tribe. So the tribe became the German peoples. But of course, at the cost of killing the Jews and the Gypsies and a bunch of other folks to develop that sense of purity. This is nationalism. Of course, there's various degrees of it. Not all nationalists become Nazis. It doesn't get as bad as Nazi Germany all the time. I'm not saying that, for example, India or China or Brazil is as bad as Nazi Germany. I'm just saying that there's degrees of it, and there's definitely aspects of this in these various countries that I've talked about, and also in the rural American politics. Then you evolve beyond that, because that's a very limited way of thinking, and now you realize that the nationalist position isn't sustainable, because actually there's a lot of nations on the planet, and we can't just be viciously national to the expense of all other nations, because then we get into fights with our neighbors. And we get World War II, millions of people die, and eventually Nazism collapses, nationalism collapses under its own weight. Because in the end, people evolve beyond that. To stage orange. Stage orange is like the founding of the US Constitution, basically. It is democracy, it is capitalist, it is free market, often it's laissez-faire capitalism, it's often neoliberal, and often libertarian. Here, examples include metropolitan USA, major cities, Japan, South Korea, Australia, France, the United Kingdom. This is sort of the standard kind of government that you expect. This is mostly what American government has been up until now. Trump is trying to pull it back towards nationalism, but before it was being pulled towards nationalism, whether it was conservative or liberal, mostly it was stage orange government. Whether it was George Bush or Bill Clinton, mostly kind of an orangish level. At this level, there's just a belief that the market will solve everything and that just growing the economy is all that we really need to do. Everyone is kind of for themselves. We don't need to have any sort of collective identity. We don't really need to worry about spirituality. We just need more science. We need more money. We need more economy. We need more technology. It's sort of this technological, scientific fantasy, thinking that will solve all the problems. But of course it doesn't. And then you reach the next level. So what's recognized at the next level, stage green, is the limitations of just unfettered capitalism. The limitations of unfettered capitalism become so obvious that we realize that the free market is really a myth. There's no such thing as the free market because corporations manipulate the market all the time to their advantage, and that these corporations become very powerful and they start to corrupt government. And that capitalism, this sort of idea of trickle-down economics, doesn't really work, because what happens is that there's a growing disparity between the lower class and the upper class, to the point where the middle class gets squeezed out, and it becomes easier and easier for the top capitalists in the country to own the entire country, basically, and then to use that wealth and money to do whatever they want. And that is unhealthy for the society as a whole. It becomes a cancer. Money becomes a cancer. Also, we realize that technology and science isn't enough to resolve these problems. So we go to stage green, Stage green is more social democratic, more socialistic. That doesn't necessarily mean it's purely socialist or communist, but more leaning towards socialism. Anarchism can arise here at stage green as well. Anarchism can be both orange or green, depending on which version of anarchism we're talking about. But generally, this is liberal, this is progressive. There's elements of New Ageism and pacifism and hippieism that come with stage green. Of course, some of the ideals here are a little bit idealistic and impractical, but nevertheless, examples include Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Switzerland, Iceland, and parts of the United States, the most progressive parts of the United States, like maybe San Francisco, the state of Washington, New York City. These are the most progressive parts of America. California, the entire state of California, to some extent, is stage green, or moving in that direction. And then beyond that, you have stage yellow, and then finally stage turquoise. The problem with talking about stage yellow and turquoise when it comes to government and politics is that there are basically no solid stage yellow or turquoise governments in the world. We're starting to see a little bit of an emergence in Northern Europe. In Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, we're starting to see little glimpses of it, but it's still very early, so it's hard to say exactly what stage yellow, let alone stage turquoise, government will look like. That's something we're going to have to invent going forward. And it's challenging. I want you to see that it's challenging to invent this stuff. It's not written in a book somewhere, what the next level of government will be. We have to figure it out. That's difficult. And it's doubly difficult when you have a bunch of stage blue or orange people who are trying to, do their damnedest to make sure that nothing changes and that we stay stage blue and stage orange, and that we just double down on that because that serves their agenda. Generally, what I think stage yellow government looks like is that it's a hybrid between socialism and capitalism, delicately balancing the pros and cons of both. It is moving towards a world government, stuff like the UN, but even more so. It is very systemic, so it thinks of social problems in a very systemic manner, and it is conscious of the entire spiral, and it's conscious of human developmental stages, and therefore what it tries to do is it tries to respect each stage without trying to oppress each stage or demonize each stage, and tries to create systems which help to move people up the spiral at their own pace. That's what yellow looks like. And then turquoise, this is hard to say, I don't know. Turquoise is based on mystical insights, a sense of Gaia. I think at turquoise, you're going to have even a larger sense of world government. Not in an oppressive way. People can still vote, and individual nations can still retain autonomy because they're hold-ons. But basically, all nations realize that they're part of the entire ecosystem of the planet, of Gaia. And spirituality now plays a much more prominent role in the culture. And it becomes an aspect of governance and of politics in a totally different way than the way that evangelicals or fundamentalist Muslims try to unify church and state. That's not what I'm talking about. Stage turquoise is a mystical type of spirituality. So what's important to understand about these various stages of political development is that each stage sees the world in a different way. Not just sees the world in a different way, but literally the world is a different way for those types of people. People at stage blue or orange or green, they're living in different worlds. There isn't one world. There's a blue world, there's an orange world, there's a green world, and so on. But the tragedy of all this is that the lower stages, anything below stage yellow, doesn't understand that there are different worlds. So the reason we have so much conflict is because the predominant stages, and most people in the world right now are at stage blue, orange, or green. None of those stages understands that there are stages. None of these stages understands that there are these different worlds. And so they try to argue with each other and fight each other, and they never are able to understand each other. For example, liberals are not able to understand stage blue conservatives because the liberals are at stage green, and they think that the blue people are crazy. Trump supporters, they seem crazy to stage green liberals, and vice versa to stage blue Trump supporters. Stage green liberal hippies, such social justice warriors, they seem crazy. But what's being missed here is the fact that your mind is constructing the world. You're not just thinking about the world and interpreting the world. You're actually participating in constructing the world. And this is lost on everybody stage green or below. There's really two tiers of politics. There's tier 1 and tier 2. Tier 1 is green, orange, blue, and everything below. Tier 2 is yellow and above. The difference between tier 1 and tier 2 is as follows. Tier 1 gets hung up on the content and is ignorant of the deeper structures, like we talked about earlier. It's hung up on positions and ideology. It's hung up on specific policy proposals like pro or anti-abortion or pro or anti-gun rights. It's based in survival. It doesn't know anything but survival. It's using politics as a survival strategy without knowing that it's doing so. Tier 2 goes meta, beyond ideologies and content, and looks at the deeper structure, looks at systemic issues, and it now recognizes something beyond survival, which is being and consciousness. And its sense of self is significantly expanded and not just limited to the physical material body. I would say less than 2% of the world population is at tier 2. Probably even less than 1%, if we really want to be brutally honest. That's the situation we find ourselves in. We desperately need more people to move from tier 1 to tier 2 if we are to fix our politics. And that is the intention of this series of episodes about conscious politics. Conscious politics only begins at tier 2. Anything in tier 1 is what I call unconscious politics, survival-based politics, politics based on selfish needs. At tier 2, you're now thinking beyond selfish needs. Now be careful here, liberals, because some of you liberals will say, Leo, but I am at tier 2 because I'm a liberal and I am progressive and I'm thinking beyond my selfish needs. I care about the poor, I care about minorities, I care about the lesbian, gay, and trans community and all this. So Leo, I'm in tier 2. No, you're not. No, you're not. Be careful. Real tier 2 is when you move beyond some of those ideological positions. You're still coming at it from a place of survival. For example, the reason you care about minorities often is times is because you are a minority and it serves your survival to care about minorities. Of course, that's pretty obvious. Also, a lot of times the reason you care about poor people or about equality and justice is because you've actually internalized this as an identity aspect of your own ego and identity, is that you care about others. That's still not quite there. That's still not quite tier 2. Of course, that's good that you've done that. It's better that you care about others than that you don't care about others. But still, you're looking at it from a survival perspective. You're not recognizing that there's something deeper at play here than just survival. Being and consciousness is running the show, and that's something that you still need to evolve up towards. Go check out my episode, Spiral Dynamics, Stage Yellow, if you want to learn about that. And also Intro to Systems Thinking. That's a good episode for you to start to move beyond traditional orthodox stage green liberalism. All right, now let me make some more fundamental points about the nature of government. First, you are part of a society whether you like it or not. There is no escaping society. This is very important that you admit, because some people have a fantasy that they can escape society. They say, well, Leo, I can just like earn $1 million or become a billionaire, and then I can go buy my own private island, just live on my private island, and I have escaped society. So what are you talking about, Leo? I can certainly be off on my own. No, you can't. Because the only meaning that your $1 billion has is thanks to society. There's no such thing as money without society. See? You can't be a billionaire and live in luxury and have a private jet and have a private island and have a fancy mansion with a fast sports car and fine food and Rolex watches and all this. You can't have this without society. Somebody's got to manufacture your private jet. Someone's got to fly your private jet for you because you can't fly it yourself. Or if you can fly it, someone has to teach you how to fly it. Someone has to create the gasoline or the jet fuel to fuel your private plane. Someone has to go fish the caviar that you're going to have in your private plane. Someone has to build your mansion. Someone has to quarry and mine the granite, the fine Italian marble that you put on your kitchen countertops in your fancy mansion. Someone has to defend your private island against pirates and invaders. And if you say, well, Leo, I'll just, I don't care about money. I'm just going to be like a hermit. I'm going to give away all my money. I'm just going to go live off by myself in the woods in the middle of Alaska, deep in the woods there, outside of town, outside of civilization. And I have escaped society and I'm independent of society. No, you're not. You're not. You're still part of Alaska. You're still part of the United States. You're a United States citizen. You are protected by the United States Army and military. Otherwise, Alaska could be conquered and taken over by Russia. You still have access to the fire department, the police. They can help you. Various wildlife services can help you. If you are getting attacked by a bear, then they can come and they can handle that bear for you. They provide you with food and resources. You can't live in the wilderness in Alaska without a gun, without matches, without lighters, without rope, without shovels, without axes. All of these things are manufactured by society. I want you to understand that you cannot survive outside of society. You will die. That's to you anarchists and libertarians out there. Some of you who have this really entitled sense of individualism and you think that you can just do it all on your own. You can't. You can't. It's never worked this way. Survival is vicious. You don't know how tough it is to survive all by yourself. Even if you go to YouTube and you type in some survival videos, some sort of Bear Grylls type of shit, where he's running around in the wilderness eating bugs and all this and surviving on basically nothing with his pocket knife. Even in those situations, he has a pocket knife. He can't manufacture his own pocket knife. He can't manufacture his own axe. He can't manufacture his own tent. And he's only out there for a few days. How are you going to live out there by yourself for decades? Not to mention which, you're going to be bored as hell. It's going to be a miserable existence for you. You're going to be totally lonely. You're going to be horny. You're going to be desperate. You're going to be craving to get back to society, to all the luxuries that society offers you. And these luxuries can only exist thanks to government and thanks to the complexity of the organizational systems and infrastructure that government has built up over the last 5,000 to 10,000 years. So understand the depth of this problem. Acknowledge that you are part of a superorganism. This superorganism doesn't just include your country. This superorganism is a superorganism of superorganisms. So your country is a superorganism, which includes you. But then beyond that, the entire world, is a superorganism that includes all countries. This is the case whether you like it or not, whether you agree with the United Nations or not. This is the case. That's the reality. You need to start acknowledging that you are part of this superorganism. It's very easy to be arrogant and to act like you're not part of it. In fact, that's one of the luxuries of this superorganism, is that it allows you so much autonomy and independence that you can forget that you're a part of a tribe. A part of a tribe, which is part of a larger tribe, part of a larger tribe, of a larger tribe, of a larger tribe, which is ultimately the whole globe. This is how reality works. It's got many layers of structure, and you are not at the top. The other important point we've got to talk about is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is vital to the functioning of this superorganism. And specifically, I want to talk about the court system, because people do not understand the significance of the court system. In our culture, colloquially, we like to make fun of the court system, various kinds of celebrity trials that are silly, and we talk about all the various bad verdicts that the court system rules and all the wrong Supreme Court decisions that happen, and we talk about how lawyers are just money hungry and they're unscrupulous and untrustworthy and all this sort of stuff. But really, the court system, the legal system, is the very heart that maintains the structure of government. Here's how it really works. Let's say we're living in a tribal society 10,000 years ago where there was no government. This is a stage purple society. There's no court systems here. And usually these tribes, there's multiple tribes living in the same area, competing over similar resources. So we have two neighboring tribes. We have tribe A and tribe B. I am from tribe A. You are from tribe B. Now I'm in tribe A, and in my tribal culture, you know, I'm a farmer. I'm raising livestock. I have pigs, whatever that I'm raising. One of my pigs runs away from me one day and goes towards the border between your tribe and my tribe. Now, remember, there's no firm legal system here, so there's no clearly demarcated border where my tribe ends and yours begins. We each have loose territories, and we roughly know where we are, but, you know, no one's ever bothered to draw a firm, clear line. So this pig, it doesn't even wander into your territory, but it wanders kind of close. It's still in my territory. And I go looking for the pig, but before I find the pig, you find the pig, and you steal it for yourself. You say, oh, look, a pig. You don't even know that it's my pig. You just say to yourself, oh, a pig. Oh, this is a nice fat pig. I'll take it for myself. You know, one of these pigs will feed my family for a whole week or for a whole month. This is nice. So you grab it. Then I discover that you stole my pig. And I go to you and I knock on your door and I start yelling at you, give me back my pig. That's my pig. And you tell me to go fuck myself. Now, me, see, in my culture, I've been raising this pig for years because I have a daughter. She needs to get married. Or rather, I have a son. I have a son who needs to marry one of my neighbor's daughters, right? And you know, to marry this beautiful woman, we need to provide a big dowry. You don't just marry who you love in a tribal culture. You got to pay for this shit. Years of work often go for a down payment on a bride in one of these cultures. So I've been growing this pig. This is a giant pig that I've been raising for years, specifically to provide as part of the dowry, this down payment to get this beautiful bride to my son so that he can procreate and, you know, have children. I can have grandchildren, and then my genes will survive, right? So I need this pig. This is a serious matter. This is not just about food. This is something bigger. But because there's no court system to adjudicate this dispute that you and I have, you know, you steal my pig, and this threatens my very survival and my son's survival, my future lineage's survival. So I need that pig back. But you have already butchered the pig and already eaten it, so you can't give it back to me. So you send me packing, you tell me to go fuck myself. So of course I go away because, your tribe is full of warriors and stuff like that. I can't just take you on by myself. So I go back to my tribe, and then I hatch my plan. I start talking bad about your tribe, how you stole my pig, to my neighbors. And I rally my warriors. We build weapons, we sharpen our knives, and we come in the middle of the night, and we slaughter a few of your children. Because we think that's only fair. Because you killed my pig, you slaughtered my pig. That pig has cost me my beautiful grandchildren. Now I've lost this beautiful bride that my son could have had. Now he has to settle for some lesser woman who has a lesser dowry. So I slaughter a few of your kids, and then what do we have? We have tribal warfare. See? Of course, you get outraged that I have slaughtered your children just for you slaughtering my pig, and then you go and you sneak in the middle of the night and you slaughter some of my children. You kill my son, and then I get outraged by that, and then I go kill your wife, and on it goes. And this can go on for hundreds of years. Literally hundreds of years can pass. And these tribes, from that one pig incident, will become vicious enemies. They go to sleep at night cursing their neighboring tribe, hoping to ethnically cleanse them out of existence. To the point where generations pass and this clan tribal warfare still rages on. The generations that came later, they don't even understand anymore. They don't even know how this whole rivalry began in the first place. They forget about the pig and the son and the bride. They don't even know any of this stuff. All that they know is that those are our evil enemies, that neighboring tribe, and we must kill them because they're evil. That's all they know. This is what the court system was designed to handle, this problem. If there's a court system in place, now there's an objective, impartial third party to whom you and I can both go to, and I could plead my case that, hey, Your Honor, he stole my pig and butchered it, and this has caused me grave harm because I can't now pay for this bride that my son needs. And that other person will say, well, Your Honor, but I was entitled to take that pig because the pig was on my land, and we have a clear boundary. We can say, okay, let's go to the government and ask the government, where exactly was the boundary? Was the pig really in his land? Because if it was, then he gets to keep the pig. But if it wasn't, then he stole it. And we have a system of what constitutes theft and stealing. These various kinds of technical rules were established so that there could be clear lines drawn within our society so that people could know what's right and what's wrong, relatively speaking. We both agree to a certain set of laws that we're going to abide to, and then we adhere to those laws, and if one of us breaks it, then we can go to court and we can adjudicate this, and then the judge will decide. The judge is impartial, ideally, and then the judge will give a sentence to one of us, and then through this process, we can resolve this dispute. So in the end, the judge might say, you stole my pig, or you stole Leo's pig, and therefore you owe him $5,000 for that pig. And then you pay that, and then I get my restitution. We're happy. I don't need to grab my knives. You don't need to grab your knives. We don't need to kill each other. That's what the court system allows. This is a brilliant invention. Somebody had to invent this. And it could only be invented within a government where the government has a monopoly of force. Individual citizens are not allowed to execute each other, precisely because if individual citizens are allowed to execute each other and render their own justice, how can you ensure that the justice that is rendered is fair and objective? Because, of course, I'm going to think that I'm right, and you're going to think that you're right, and that's not going to be enough. That leads to clan warfare. We need a third party, someone who's impartial, to take care of this for us. And this is to the benefit of both of us, because it means that my son and your children don't get slaughtered. That's how this works. Fair, uncorrupt court systems are vital to maintaining peace amongst human beings, because what they are really is an orderly process for adjudicating disputes. And if there is not such a process, then there will be blood. There will be blood. This is how things actually work. Not the libertarian free market fantasy, but this is how things actually work when you don't have government. And you can actually go and read books and study about how tribal cultures live. This is not speculation. You can go and find these tribal cultures today in Papua New Guinea, in the Amazon, in Africa, and you can study them. And in fact, I have some books on my book list. Go check that out. Some important books which talk about these sorts of examples in my politics section. I have a politics category within the book list. The reality is that you cannot stop people from organizing at higher levels, because that's what life wants to do. That's what makes government so difficult. You see, it's not just that people come together and are organized into one group called the government. No. It's way more complicated than that. If you have a free market, people form all sorts of groups and subgroups, groups within groups within groups within groups. People form cabals, gangs, syndicates, mafias, cliques, masterminds, think tanks, lobbies, parties, factions, cults, subcultures, religions, clubs, militias. All of this naturally gets formed if you give people the freedom to form groups, which of course exists. In your libertarian fantasy, you libertarians, how do you stop people from forming these groups when people have freedom? The freedom that you love so much. You can't. You can't stop them. And now you say, Leo, well, so what? Yeah, they'll form these groups. That's good. No problem. Big problem. Because the whole point of forming these groups is to gain survival advantage. People are not just forming these groups because it's fun. People are forming these groups because this is how they fucking survive. This is how they feed themselves. This is how they reproduce. So what happens when I form my religion and you form your religion? And your religion contradicts my religion because my religion says that I'm the best religion and your religion says that it's the best religion. What do we do then? When we don't have a court to adjudicate our issues, we don't have a constitution, we don't have a monopoly of force by some external third party, what happens is that I tell my religious followers that your religion is evil and that they need to sharpen their knives. And you do the same. And then we have a war. And millions of people die. That's what happens in a free market. These various cabals and syndicates that are formed precisely so that if I form a group that can accumulate power, can help ourselves to get some advantage, either some technological advantage, some strategic advantage, some political advantage, some ideological advantage. We can form a group, we can become more powerful, we can dominate their other groups. We can grow our group to oppress all the other groups, unless something stops it. What would that be? In a free market scenario, nothing would stop it. And therefore you get slavery. In the current system that we have, a government has been developed to prevent that. So the beauty of our government is that it allows the peaceful coexistence of all sorts of interesting subgroups. There are all sorts of corporations and lobbies and think tanks and factions and parties and cults and subcultures and religions and clubs and militias, which exist within just American government alone. And they can all coexist and not slaughter each other or enslave each other or dominate each other because we have a court system, because we have a constitution which says that there's freedom of religion and that one religion can't oppress everybody else. One religion, for example, can't take over the schools and substitute all the textbooks with its Bible. But if there was no such constitutional mandate and there was no court system and there was no police force to enforce this, you better fucking believe that the most powerful religion in our society would do just that. The religion with the most money would hire the most mercenaries and would print the most Bibles and would take over the schools and replace the textbooks with Bibles, their Bibles. That's what they would do. Because this is how selfishness operates. This is survival. Not only do you need to appreciate, like I said in part 1 of this series, that humans are extremely vicious, but they're extremely sneaky and manipulative on top of that. People organize to rig the rules of society in their favor, precisely because that helps them to survive. You would be stupid not to do it. What libertarians and anarchists don't understand is that this force to organize at higher levels is irrepressible. You cannot stop it. Even government cannot stop it. And what they misunderstand is how sneaky and manipulative human psyches are to accomplish survival. They will find every loophole within a free market to oppress and dominate and gain favor for themselves. That is what's going to happen. And they are not going to have any moral qualms about it, because the majority of people are not at a universal stage of moral development where they care and love everybody equally. This is less than 1% of the population. To get to a point where morality is widespread throughout culture already requires thousands of years of government and education on a massive scale. That's the reality. Next point. Society is grossly unfair, selfish, exploitative, and barbaric. I'm not just talking about societies of the past. I'm talking about today. I'm talking about America. I'm talking even about the most developed countries in the world. Grossly barbaric. People are in denial about how unjust society is because they are selfish. When you're selfish, you don't care about truth or equality or fairness. All you care about is that which serves you and whatever you identify with. So if you identify with you, yourself, your tribe, that's all you care about. If some other tribe is oppressed or murdered or extinguished, you don't care. That's what selfishness means. And most people are at that level of development. Most people are too busy following their survival agenda to care about how others are being exploited. It's not in their benefit to even be aware of exploitation if they are on the receiving end of the exploitation's fruits. And what's worse, the way that oppression works, it becomes so internalized, this oppression, in one's own worldview from birth and from indoctrination, that those who are oppressed do not even recognize that they are being oppressed. For example, the women in Saudi Arabia who are oppressed do not fully recognize that they are oppressed because their culture teaches them that this oppression is just normal and how it should be. Women are not supposed to dress in skirts or wear makeup or, expose their hair. And many women in Saudi Arabia have internalized this so deeply from birth through indoctrination that they actually, if you ask them, they honestly will tell you that, oh, Leo, I'm not being oppressed. This is just all part of my culture. This is part of Islam. I'm just being a good Islamic woman. This is how you be a good Saudi. Now, of course, there are women in Saudi Arabia who can see through that. There are even women's rights movements and all this. They recently got the right to drive. That was a big deal for them. So, of course, many of them do understand the oppression, but many don't. Many are just so deeply indoctrinated, they don't see it. That's the tragedy of oppression. You don't always know that you're oppressed. Same thing, for example, with many slaves, house slaves. You know, it's easy if you're a house slave to rationalize to yourself that, oh, I'm not even that oppressed. Because, you know, those slaves that are working in the fields, they're the ones who have it terrible and bad. I'm actually lucky to be a house slave. A lot of house slaves thought that way. And today, we have many wage slaves. We have millions of wage slaves under the capitalist system, which are brutally oppressed economically. But they don't even know that they're economically oppressed. They have no idea. And those who are doing the oppressing are in denial about it because it serves them. Their employers are, of course, in denial about the wage slavery. They think it's totally normal because their culture has normalized it. Hey, this is just part of capitalism, you know. If you don't like it, go get a better job. See, the oppression is not happening because there's some evil genius individual sitting there thinking of how to oppress people. That's not how oppression works. Oppression is just brute survival happening blindly. And then the denial that anything is wrong. It's just selfishness. That's all it is. The oppression is systemic. The oppression is cultural, not individual. I'm not just saying that there's some evil CEO who is, you know, running some sort of minimum wage sweatshop somewhere in America. Of course, there is that. There's plenty of that. That's a problem. But there's a deeper problem. The oppression is cultural because it's the culture, it's American culture, business culture, which allows employers to suck dry all of the wages of their employees without compensating them as well as they otherwise would have if they had some compassion and a larger sense of self. Not fairly compensating these employees and kind of sucking them dry, using them as wage slaves. This is considered totally normal and, in fact, necessary within Wall Street business culture. And in fact, if a CEO isn't doing this, he will get angry calls from his stockholders who will demand that he push down wages as much as possible and break unions and deny people bonuses for their overtime work because the stockholders, they want those dividends. And the stockholders don't care about the employees because the stockholder has a very contracted sense of self just about his stock portfolio. That's all he cares about. He doesn't care about the employees working at the companies that he owns stock in. Doesn't matter to him. That's our system right now. And everybody just thinks it's normal and that this is cool. And of course, when you benefit from it, it is cool. It's great to be the CEO of a giant company where all of the wage slaves are working for you, and therefore you can have an income which is 5,000 times greater than the average wage that your employees make. It's great. For Jeff Bezos, it's great. For Bill Gates, it's great. For Steve Jobs, it's great. And they don't even know that there's a problem. Why not? Because this is the system they grew up in. This is the culture. This is stage orange. It's totally normal. And their sense of self is roughly what it was for most of their adult life. They're not really working on growing themselves spiritually. And so that's the system. And in fact, they might argue, well, even if I wanted to change the system, it's too hard to change the system. That's right. Even if Steve Jobs or Elon Musk decided that, okay, I want to be very generous with my employees, he'll get kicked out of the corporation. The stockholders and the boardroom will kick him out. That's what'll happen. In fact, Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple. Now, of course, not for those same reasons. Early in Apple's history, Steve Jobs actually got kicked out of the company that he himself has started. That's how it works. The system is so out of control that even the CEOs don't control it. It's a cultural problem. It's a lack of cultural development and a lack of collective consciousness, not just individual consciousness. Responsibility needs to be taken not just at an individual level, but at a collective level. This is something that the right-wingers don't fully understand. They love to talk about taking personal responsibility, but they never take collective responsibility. Part of what it means to take personal responsibility is that you recognize that you're part of a collective and that you have collective responsibility too. You see? It's not enough to just say to a poor person, oh, pull yourself by your bootstraps, man, go get a second job, work harder. No, there are systemic cultural problems that need to be changed that you must first take responsibility for, otherwise we can't change it. For example, racism is not just an individual problem. It's not just that I'm telling you that you shouldn't be a racist. Of course, I am telling you that, but hopefully you knew that already. As an individual, hopefully you're not a racist. But that's not the issue. The deeper issue is that you need to recognize that there's racism at a systemic level, and that can't be fixed until you take responsibility for it, even though you yourself, as an individual, might not be a racist at all. But your culture and your society is racist, or has remnants of racism in it. So the conservatives are correct. It is important to take personal responsibility. But that's a very narrow definition of responsibility. Personal responsibility has to go full circle and to include collective responsibility as well. Right now, in stage orange societies, one of the biggest ways that people are oppressed is not so much racially or sexually, even though that still exists, but it's economically. This is one of our greatest struggles, is the economic barbarism that exists in some of the most developed countries right now. What I mean by that is that we have people in our society who have billions of dollars and millions of dollars, way more than they can ever possibly use. They squander this money on stupid things like golden toilets and private islands and yachts and jets and all sorts of ridiculousness, while at the same time we have people in society who are actually working 2 jobs. Mothers who are working 2 jobs can barely sustain their children, can't put their children into proper daycare or send them to a good school so that they can grow up and have a decent shot at life and raise their own consciousness. These poor people who are not poor because they don't work hard. They're poor because of how the whole system is structured. You see, they weren't born into the right family, under the right circumstances. They weren't able to get the best private education at Harvard and so forth. Therefore, they can't have jobs that pay that awesome money that you need to really thrive in life. And so these people are so busy working every single day as wage slaves just to meet their basic needs that they are unable to self-actualize. They don't have time or energy at the end of the day to self-actualize. They don't have money to buy self-actualization resources like books or courses, let alone to go beyond self-actualization to self-transcendence, because they are so low at the lowest stages of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this ends up regressing all of society. This is one of our greatest challenges that needs to be resolved. Because of this, tens of millions of people are not actualizing their full potential as human beings. They're not becoming great teachers and professors and scientists and artists and educators and speakers and spiritual teachers and entrepreneurs the way that they could, because their family is barely able to scrape by. See? And this ends up costing all of society enormously, because all of those people, tens of millions of people, are not contributing to society at their maximum. Think about all the amazing scientists and inventors and engineers and artists and entrepreneurs and leaders that we could have had if our resources were better distributed. This would not just benefit the poor. This would benefit everybody, because those amazing scientists would make breakthroughs in cancer research, and those amazing entrepreneurs would come up with new businesses, new websites, new apps, new technology. And then, those amazing teachers and educators, they would educate our children better. It would improve everything for everybody, including the lives of the CEO and the billionaires. Their lives too would be improved. Because you know what? When a billionaire gets cancer, if it's a rare type of cancer that has no cure, he's dead. But if he wasn't so adamant in sucking up the wages of all his employees, maybe some of his employees could actually fund their children to go to a nice school, a nice university, become actually like a cancer scientist and come up with a new cure or a solution to that cancer that the billionaire had. So the billionaire is going to die with billions of excess dollars because that money wasn't properly distributed in our society in order to allow for the majority of its citizens to flourish to their full potential. You see, it all interconnects. It all comes back around. It's karma. This is why it matters. This is why it matters to you, even if you're comfortable right now, even if you're in the upper class. And you know what? I'm in the upper class. I'm rich. This doesn't affect me. I'm rich. I've escaped wage slavery. I can live for the rest of my life comfortably, never having to worry about money again. So I'm saying all of this not because I'm poor and I need to change the system in order to benefit myself. No, actually, the things that I'm saying are actually going to be, in a sense, to my detriment, at least in the short term. Because what I'm talking about is actually making it harder for me. Like, I could right now go and hire a bunch of employees and exploit them to make a lot of money. That would become harder for me under a new system, a more evolved system. But see, I'm not thinking about this selfishly in like, what is most best for Leo? That's tier 1. I'm thinking about this from tier 2, not what's best for Leo, but what's best for mankind. What's best for the universe? What's best for consciousness? And if that happens to encroach on Leo a little bit, if that makes it a little bit harder for me, I'm okay with that. That's selflessness. That's conscious politics. Correcting oppression and inequality, very ironically, makes the oppressors feel oppressed. Because that's how selfishness works. So if I'm a slave owner and I have 100 slaves who work my plantation, if a movement arises that starts to say that, oh, slavery is immoral and evil, first of all, how am I going to react? Am I going to be sympathetic to that? Of course not. Because it directly threatens my survival. I'm the one who has to give up his slaves. I don't want to do that. Those slaves give me a cushy life. Of course I'm not going to give it up. In fact, I'm going to go one step further. I am going to act like the victim now. Because this is what the ego does. It's sneaky. It's selfish. I am going to act like the victim, and I'm going to say that you are oppressing me. How dare you take away my slaves? That's immoral and evil. Look at how unfair you're being. It's totally normal that I have 100 slaves. It's fair. It has to be this way. They're not real humans. They're like animals. They just work for me. This is how I think. This is how the ego has to rationalize to itself its own selfishness. You see, it's not about truth. It's not about science or fairness or logic. The logic serves whatever serves me. This is devilry. This is how it works. The people who are gaining from the oppressive system manufacture ideologies and narratives which justify, first and foremost, not to others, but to themselves, that what they're doing is actually good and proper. Because I cannot be a slave owner while at the same time I think that slavery is evil and wrong, because that's a cognitive dissonance in my mind. I have to wake up every morning and feel good about myself. That's what the ego has to do. The ego has to feel right all the time. So if the ego is right, that means that owning slaves is right, because that's what I have right now, if that's the scenario we're considering. You see? So I'm going to spin various kinds of narratives. I'm going to bring in science as well. I'm going to use science to tell you why those slaves deserve to be my slaves. That's how this works. That's what we're dealing with. And of course, I'm going to vehemently resist the changing of my culture, the changing of the norms of my culture, to say that slavery is evil. I can't have that. I can't have that written in the books. You can't teach that to children because this conflicts. So I'm gonna start my own lobbying group, which is actually going to print textbooks for children, which is going to use science and religion to justify why actually slavery is good. And you know why I'm doing all this? Because I have children that I need to feed. And those slaves feed my children. And what I really care about is the survival of my children. That's selfishness. That's how this works. Replace slaves or slave owners with CEOs and Wall Street hedge fund managers. It's the same thing, just various degrees of it. So, of course, they're in denial about it. You must be. Selfishness only works when you're not conscious of how selfish you're being and how much it hurts others. It only works when you don't care about others, when your circle of concern is limited. Then what you can do is you can externalize the suffering and oppression outside of the circle of concern, and then you can create this little comfortable bubble for yourself to live in. That's the name of the game. Those in power do not want to give up power, and they perceive anything that takes away their power as unfair by definition. That's the trick. But all oppression and selfishness is unsustainable in the long run, and it ends up backfiring. If a government becomes too unfair, the people will take matters into their own hands. There will be protests, civil disobedience, and ultimately violence, revolution, and coups until the situation is equalized. And that's what many political revolutions are about. Equalization of gross injustices that cannot be resolved in any other way but through violence. Because the people who are doing the oppressing are so stuck in their own rationalizations and justifications for their oppression, saying that their oppression is actually normal and good and just, that you can't convince them otherwise but through violence, through physical force. And government, ideally, is put in place to reduce these sorts of gross inequalities and oppressions. If it's not doing that, then it's not a good government. And therefore, the government itself is corrupt and it needs reform. And of course, definitely government can be corrupt. All of these forces can corrupt government as well. You know, if I'm a slave owner, I'm going to go pay millions of dollars to lobby the government to make sure that slavery is not abolished. Of course, it makes perfect sense for me to do that. See? Another point that people overlook is that you shouldn't assume that what's good for you is good for everyone else. This is just not the case. The key point here is that many people profit and survive off the suffering of others. There are entire professions that are designed off the suffering of others. Millions of people in our society feed their children because their job is to pull resources away from those who need it, make them suffer, to give to your children. What's good for the nation as a whole is bad for many companies, elites, politicians, and exploiters. For example, peace is bad for the military-industrial complex. Even though peace is the ultimate ideal. Any conscious person understands this. But for those millions of people who work for the military-industrial complex, for them, what matters first and foremost is not peace as some abstraction for some other people that they don't know, like for the Middle East. They don't care about peace for the Middle East because they're more concerned about feeding their children and sending their children to Harvard. So these people work in the military-industrial complex. They deny to themselves that there's a problem with working in the military-industrial complex. In fact, they create all sorts of stories and narratives to excuse and to justify why working in the military-industrial complex is actually good. And they tell themselves, oh, peace is not really possible. Leo, we have so many enemies abroad. What are you talking about? Peace? This is just some hippie ideal. The fact is we need bombers, we need missiles and weapons, and someone's got to do it, and so I'm doing it. And I'm protecting the country. You're being selfish first and foremost. Realize that. And the rest is all sorts of narratives that you spin. Free healthcare, for example, is bad for insurance companies and for many wealthy doctors and hospitals. In America, this is especially the case. This is the problem we have right now. We have a healthcare mafia which has a stranglehold on the entire American healthcare system. Thousands of people die unnecessarily every single year. Why? Because these hospitals, these doctors, and these insurance companies want to rake in as much money as possible. Pharmaceutical companies as well. Does any of this matter to them? How do they justify it to themselves? Society has a pre-made set of narratives which make all of this normal. So they go to sleep just fine at night. Because you know what? What does the big pharma CEO tell them? Oh, well, I got shareholders that I got to work for, and this is a free market economy. And if some sick kid can't afford health care, well, he should have worked harder. He should get a job. His parents should have provided for him. He needs to take personal responsibility. That's the problem. See? And this entire healthcare industry is going to lobby to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars, to make sure that free healthcare, free quality healthcare for all Americans is not offered by the government. Because that would put them out of business. How are they going to feed their children? How are they going to pay for their golf course and their private jet? How are they going to buy their Rolex watch? See? So in their mind, it's not that they're just resisting free healthcare. It's that they actually think that free healthcare is bad. It's un-American. It's anti-capitalist. It's socialist. It's Marxist. It's going too far. It's big government. But if your circle of concern actually was truly universal, if you expanded what you considered your sense of self, if you identified with all Americans, would you really be okay with tens of thousands of Americans dying unnecessarily every year, simply because they can't afford some ridiculously overpriced medication or some ridiculously overpriced surgery? Would a humane, conscious, loving society treat all of its citizens in such a fashion, such a barbaric fashion, where they just have to survive on their own if they get cancer or if they get, some heart condition or whatever? No, of course not. If someone in your family, like your mother, got sick, and you had the money and the resources to help her, but you didn't because you said, oh, well, it's her responsibility. She should have thought of that before she got sick. She should just pull her up by herself, up by the bootstraps. Not my problem. See, you would immediately recognize how barbaric you're being if you thought that way. Why is that? Because most people's sense of self includes their family, their immediate family, to the point where they won't allow an immediate family member to, go hungry or to starve to death or to die if they can help it reasonably. Of course, there's limits to what you can do. But the only problem is that your circle of concern is not wide enough to go beyond your family and beyond your tribe of people to everybody, universally. And that's because you haven't developed yourself to that level yet. Free education, free high-quality education is very bad for private schools and universities. Threatens them enormously. So of course they're going to lobby against it. Another very important point that people overlook is that normativity does not exist. Normativity is a sort of a nerdy philosophical concept. What it means is that all norms are arbitrary and relative. There are no shoulds in reality. There's nothing you should do, nor can you make someone else do what you think they should do because you made it up. Therefore, morality is relative. Government is necessary precisely because normativity doesn't exist. If normativity existed, if there was objective morality, then it would be very easy to get people to agree on it. In the same way that, for example, it's very easy to get everyone on the planet Earth to agree about the existence of the sun. You don't need to debate very hard. You don't need to present scientific data. You don't need to, create elaborate courses and textbooks to get people to understand that there's a sun. Because it shines every morning when they get up. It's obvious. That's what we call objective. This is not the case for morality. This is not the case for thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not steal. People disagree on all these things. People have different moralities based on their sense of self. Self is relative as well. How you define yourself is all relative, which makes normativity impossible, which means that we need to come together and create a sort of a consensus about what the rules are of the game. We get to make up the rules. There are no rules handed down to us by God on some stone tablet. We got to make up the rules. And that becomes very tricky because who gets to say what the rules are? If everybody knows that the rules of the game are made up, whoa. That's a very different situation than when most of the people think that the rules are etched in a stone tablet. Most people in society think that the rules of society and morality are etched on a stone tablet by God, or whatever you justify or ground your morality in. It might be universal principles or whatever. And so people become ideological about what should and shouldn't be done by humans, precisely because it's made up. And then they have to be in denial about the fact that it's made up, because if they admit that it's all made up, then they can't ground and anchor their sense of self and reality into that. You see? So what the ego wants to do is the ego wants to make up the rules of the game but then to deny that it made them up. It wants to objectivize them, to reify them. The ego wants to objectivize its own personal selfishness, bias, and preferences. So if your preference is that gay sex is dirty, then you want to not just have that as a preference. Your ego wants to say that gay sex isn't just dirty, in my opinion, from my perspective. Gay sex is wrong because it's an abomination in the eyes of God. Absolutely so. Likewise, your ego doesn't want to admit that murder isn't actually objectively wrong. Why not? Because otherwise then you could be murdered. And then someone could say, well, yeah, I murdered your family, but it wasn't wrong. And to you, that's extremely threatening. And so you do not want to open yourself to that possibility. So you actually want a culture and a society and a government that objectivizes that murder is wrong, because that gives you comfort and security. It also makes you feel good for not murdering people. Makes you feel like a good little boy and a good little girl. See, that's the game here. Very, very sneaky. This is all the mechanics of devilry at work at a collective level. I also want you to understand that the entire political spectrum of left versus right and all the gradations that exist in between is completely relative. What counts as the left or the right is totally relative to the era and the culture in which you're living right now. So what is considered the left today was not the left 100 years ago, and vice versa. This relativity is precisely what allows for the thing called the Overton window. Maybe you've heard of it in political discussions. The Overton window can shift. This is sort of like the average, or the center of gravity of the conversation can shift between left and right depending on era and culture. You know, the Overton window can shift. And the reason that this Overton window exists at all is precisely because all political positions are totally relative. You make them up. You imagine them. There is no true left and true right. Slavery, for example, is considered evil today, but it wasn't 300 years ago. And what I'm telling you is that it's not that the people 300 years ago were wrong and that today we're right. What I'm telling you is that there is no right and wrong. We make it up. So if we say that slavery is not evil, it's not evil. If we say that slavery is evil, it becomes evil. And the reason people get upset by admitting this is precisely because they really want slavery to be objectively evil in some sort of concrete sense. And that's just not the case, which is precisely why slavery existed. See, if slavery was truly objectively evil in a concrete sense, slavery would have never existed. By the way, you know, an interesting point about slavery, the only stage of political development at which slavery gets abolished is stage orange and above. Spiral dynamics we're talking about here. So at stage purple, red, and blue, slavery exists. And it's not considered evil. Only at stage orange and above. So what you consider good and bad, right and wrong, are relative to how developed you are and relative to what your ego is identified with. You have to be very careful about applying today's moral standards and our own consciousness from today to standards of centuries ago. This is a mistake that many liberals make that I see, is that they try to like demonize or judge people in the past, like for example, Thomas Jefferson or some of the founding fathers, who many of them were slave owners, liberals will often say something like, well, they weren't decent men. They were actually evil slave owners, and they were vicious racists and all this. And I mean, of course, that's true from our perspective today. But what you have to acknowledge is that that's only true from our perspective today, thanks to all the evolution we've done over the last 300 years to get to today. It wasn't true back then. And so it's improper to apply standards of today to 300 years ago. Because when you do that, what you're not being conscious of and what you're not appreciating, what you're taking for granted, is that we build on the shoulders of giants. This is how evolution works. Nothing is a given. It all has to be built from scratch. It has to be invented. The idea that slavery is evil had to be invented and spread throughout mainstream culture until the point where it became so obvious that we don't even question it anymore today. This was not obvious 300 years ago. And in fact, many people opposed it. We had an entire civil war over that. You see, so the poles of what is left and what is right is changing and evolving all the time. Such that actually what's happening is that as evolution happens, we become more progressive and more liberal and more liberal and more liberal. So the stuff that many conservatives oppose actually is the stuff that will become the future after they die in the next generation. And so on and so on and so on and so on. People are always clinging to the status quo, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's slavery or racism or sexism or capitalism. It doesn't matter. They cling to it because that's just what they've been indoctrinated with. And they're just conforming. It's just conformist consciousness. And then they have to die for the next generation. And then slowly, culture evolves in this fashion. This is what happens. And in this way, the Overton window shifts and shifts and shifts to the point where today, even the most rabid right-wing conservative today would not argue that slavery is proper. It's unthinkable to argue that today. You would be booed and probably physically attacked in any public setting where a serious intellectual person stood up and say, well, you know what, slavery is actually okay and proper. Even the KKK won't say this today. That's how much the Overton window has shifted to the left relative to where it was just 150 years ago, during the Civil War. During the Civil War, many people, probably a significant chunk of the country, would have actually argued that slavery is proper. The reason that this shift can happen is not because people were wrong and now they're right. It's because there is no right and wrong. We make it up. And what I'm telling you is that this Overton window in the next 500 years will shift so radically to the left that the people who are alive today, even the most liberal people who are alive today, if they were just plopped into 500 years in the future, like they took a time machine, they would have a conniption when they saw how progressive society is 500 years from now, because they are so used to the barbarism of today. Today's barbarism is so normalized, it ain't considered barbarism. It will only look like barbarism from the future. All progress is relative to one's past position. You can't compare countries to each other simplistically the way that people like to do. You can't just take America and Saudi Arabia and just compare them. And so well, Saudi Arabia is less developed. That means they must be stupider or less intelligent, or it must be the Muslims. The Muslims are clearly an inferior religion because they're not as developed as America. You can't do this. You have to appreciate that some regions of the world are much harder to survive in than others. There were different historical starting points. So, of course, different countries will be at different levels of development because they had different strengths and weaknesses and different obstacles to deal with. You know how much harder it is to create a stable government in certain parts of the world. For example, in the Middle East, where there was enormous tribal warfare due to limited resource and very hard geographic conditions. And also, for example, in Africa, some European folks who like to fancy themselves as superior to Africans, they would like to create this narrative that, oh, well, the Africans are so backwards. Leo, if the Africans have the same IQ as whites and Europeans, then how come they don't have good governments over there? Well, a lot of it has to do with the geography. Africa is a very difficult continent to survive in. The jungles they have, the vicious wild animals, it's hard to even build a city in a jungle because the jungle just overruns it, breaks through your cement and concrete roads and everything, breaks your pipes and your plumbing. The insects, the diseases that exist there because it's a swampy, sort of a rainforesty, wet, moist environment makes building a government there much, much more hard. So you have to take all that into account. You're comparing apples and oranges. Also, watch out for romanticizing the past. This is a common mistake that I see people make, especially conservatives. Somehow they say, well, if we just go back, we roll the clock back to the 1950s or to the founding of America, the Wild West. Those were the days where people were free and everything was nice. Or if we just roll the clock back before the rise of civilizations where people just lived in little agrarian tribal communities. Everything was nice back then. You live in nature, Leo. It was beautiful. People just lived in the Garden of Eden, and they just foraged for whatever they wanted to. There was ample food, and there was no oppressive government, and everything was nice. No, it wasn't. Genocide was rampant. Slavery was rampant. Famine and disease were rampant. Poverty was rampant. Illiteracy was rampant. You have no idea how terrible it was. Never forget that 40% of the Roman population were slaves. And even if they weren't, society cannot go backwards to a simpler time. Society is part of evolution. Evolution is moving everything forward. Society must evolve because technology evolves. As technology evolves, power dynamics change, structures change, things that were possible no longer become possible and sustainable. You cannot roll the clock back to some pre-agrarian society while maintaining airplanes, global travel, space satellites, global communications, telephones, smartphones, the internet. I mean, what fantasy world are you living in? Nuclear weapons? And you want to live in some agrarian society? You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Technology can't just be forgotten. It's here, we have to deal with it. Advanced, complex technologies require complex logistics chains, complex manufacturing industry, universities, government subsidies, government regulations to make sure all that stuff works, advanced education systems, universities, schools. Everything is interconnected. As we develop new advanced technologies, this requires radical cultural change for these technologies to be sustainable and workable and not to destroy society. The printing press, the invention of the printing press revolutionized religion. You can't do religion the same way that you used to once the printing press is invented. The power dynamics change. With the printing press, all of a sudden, it's easy to print books. Everyone can have their own personal Bible. You don't need priests who preach down to you in Latin because the Bible is only written in Latin and only available to them because every book costs thousands of dollars and nobody can afford it. Now everybody can afford it. Now the books are translated into common languages that anybody can read. And now all of a sudden the priesthood loses its power. This is what the Protestant Reformation was was about to some extent. The democratization of Christianity, the decentralization of the Catholic Church, and its hegemony on religion in Europe. See? Nothing can stay the same with evolution. Constant change, otherwise you're going to die. And that's the whole game here, is that egos are trying to play this game so that they can survive long enough not to go extinct and for their children to go extinct. And so they're trying to manipulate this whole system. They're trying to create an environment for themselves, which is most ideal to their genes being passed on. Another very important point is that society is incredibly complex and counterintuitive. Solutions which you think will solve everything and will help everybody end up actually backfiring and making things worse. This is one of the problems with tier 1 consciousness and tier 1 cognition, is that it thinks that it has all the easy solutions to society's problems because it thinks that society is just very simple and it basically only looks at the status quo. It's not looking towards the future, towards new technologies, disruptive technologies which are arising, which require social change. It's not thinking about that at all. It's denying that. So new technology requires systemic thinking. Systemic thinking deals with the counterintuitive nature of complex systems. Really go watch my episode, Intro to Systems Thinking, to understand this deeper. One of the keys to systems thinking is that you understand that any change you make to the system in a local area will affect the whole thing because it's an interconnected system. And there are complex feedback loops. And so you study these systems very carefully before you change or tinker with them because you understand how dangerous it can be to tinker with a system. Also, it can be dangerous to maintain the status quo of the system without anticipating the new environmental changes that are happening. This kind of systemic, complex thinking only happens at tier 2 because people are too selfish and too worried about satisfying their own short-term needs at tier 1, stages blue, orange, and green, in order to really be good systems thinkers. Systems thinking requires objectivity. And this is what we need badly from our politicians, and from our leaders, and from our scientists, and from our citizens too. Because you can't elect a systems thinker into office unless the person who's doing the electing is advanced enough to appreciate the value of systems thinking. See? You can only vote as high as you yourself are in your consciousness and development. Now, some people here will say, Leo, but we do have, like, Trump is a good systems thinker. He's really good at manipulating systems. He's so good at it. He's a secret genius because he's so good at manipulating systems. This is not systems thinking. Selfish manipulation of a system is not the same thing as systems thinking. A key quality of systems thinking is that you're not thinking about the system in ways in which to manipulate it for your own personal benefit. You're thinking about how to make this system function in a healthy way for the greater good. And of course, Trump is the opposite of a systems thinker. Trump is a selfish, opportunistic manipulator, not a systems thinker. Can he exploit a system to satisfy his ego? Yeah, he's pretty good at that. But he ain't no systems thinker. Systems thinking understands the importance of balance, delicate balance between various kinds of dichotomies and dualities, such as freedom versus regulation, or capitalism versus socialism, or individualism versus collectivism, or masculine versus feminine. It understands that taking one side in any of these debates is going to lead to disastrous pathological consequences. And you can only start to appreciate the delicate balance of nature when you get to tier 2 and above, Really, mysticism teaches you the importance of balance, the whole yin-yang thing. See? Go study some Taoism. So this is what is missing. And remember, balance does not mean that you just split everything down the middle. I am not saying that we need to take pro-slavery positions and anti-slavery positions and just take the middle point between the two and call that balance. That's not balance. That's devilry. True balance is you look at every situation carefully, and sometimes you make a clear decision, like slavery is clearly not something that our society should tolerate. And that's balance. That's proper balance. Now, of course, to a slave owner, that doesn't look like balance. To a slave owner, his bias projected onto what I just said makes it look like I am being biased. So now we're wrapping up part 2. There's still so much more to say, so much more foundation to lay, believe it or not. We're really going deep here. I hope you can tell. Now you might wonder, but Leo, how do I know the things that you say here are true and that they're not just your ideology? As always with my work, you need to observe this for yourself, happening in life. So the solution is observe, observe, observe. Study history, study politics, observe how political actors behave in the media, in the news, on YouTube, and elsewhere. Be open-minded as you do this. Be objective, be unbiased, be selfless. Otherwise, you're going to have a totally warped perspective. See, your ego is warping how you do your observation. So if you want to do your observation properly to understand the things that I say, you got to really step outside of any preconceived ideas that you have about politics and government. And also, very importantly, have mystical experiences. Mystical experiences open your heart and open your sense of self to the most widest levels, to the universal levels. Only really once you're at a universal level of consciousness and self can you truly understand what a conscious society looks like, where we care about each other and help each other and not working against each other, where the entire world becomes your family, where your compassion expands to everybody, to your friends and your enemies alike, no matter what race they are, what color they are, what country they live in, what their political positions are. You become conscious that all of them are an aspect of your own self and that all of it is deeply interconnected and that we're all in this boat together and that we need to work together. So for that, you need to do the spiritual work. Be careful not to turn conscious politics into an ideology. You certainly could turn everything I'm saying here into an ideology. That is not what I want you to do. That would be a mistake. But anyways, that's enough for today. Next time, we're going to talk about more foundational ideas, new stuff that I haven't said yet, and we're also going to get into the principles of conscious politics. We're really going to get to define it. I'm going to give you a list of principles. And then there's going to be a part 4 as well. And in part 4, I'm going to give you specific policy ideas for how to turn our society into a conscious one. That's it. I'm done here. Please click that like button and come check out Actualized.org, where you'll find my blog. You'll find amazing stuff on my blog. I'm posting every day now, videos and examples, especially about politics. And you'll find resources there that I link to. And check out my book list, which has a bunch of books about politics on it that will help you to understand these things deeper. And spiral dynamics and developmental psychology and all this is there. And my life purpose course. And then the forum where you can come and chat about this stuff. We're having interesting discussions on the forum these days about conscious politics. So come join, and I'll see you in part 3.